go over these definitions to let you know basically what's going on. The first definition is dynasty, which is a sequence of rulers from the same family, stock, or group. And there were other nationalities and civilizations that had dynasties also, but we're going to focus on African dynasties. And the one that we're focusing on in particular today is the Egyptian dynasties, okay? To give you a good example, you might have a King Ramses. And you have King Ramses the first, King Ramses the second, King Ramses the third. Well, that was the same stock or the same group or the same family that ruled during a certain period of time in Africa, in Egypt, okay? All right, the next definition is Heracleopolis or Nakin, which is another word, and it is a place found between Upper and Lower Egypt. One of the most important and early archaeological sites in Egypt, for the simple fact that the artifacts that we're dealing with found in this land. Okay, now Upper Egypt is located more south, what we call south today in Egypt, and Lower Egypt is more north, what we call north today. You see what I'm saying? So it's the opposite. Where Heracleopolis, or aka Nakin, was in between Upper and Lower Egypt, and that's where they found, when they excavated, that's where they found these archaeological findings that we're talking about today, which is the Narmer Palette, okay, what it's called. That's what it's called. You also might want to note that it's right above Nubia. The next definition I want to go over is Pharaoh. Pharaoh is a ruler of ancient Egypt, was originally called king, okay? The Greeks came along and called it Pharaoh. But really, we were called kings and queens, all right? And like I like to tell people, I don't consider invaders to be the original or indigenous people of the land. If you invade a land, your title can't be king or your title can't be pharaoh because you're an invader. So some people who study history, some professors, some professional historians, they might call invaders pharaohs or kings. Well, I personally don't consider them pharaohs or kings for the simple fact that they were invaders. I always give a good example. If you have a German shepherd and you bring a German shepherd to America, you don't call him an American shepherd. He's still a German shepherd. You understand what I'm saying? So therefore, how can you call these people that invaded kings or queens? You know, some of the indigenous people of that land, once they were invaded by another group of people, they didn't acknowledge the invaders. So why should we? I'm only going to acknowledge the people that originally ruled, who were originally from that land. And I'm going to call them pharaohs or kings. You know what I'm saying? You had an era called the Ptolemaic era. And these were people who, I should say, Greeks that invaded Africa, Alexander the Great or Alexander the Greek or whatever you want to call them. Well, during the Ptolemaic era, they were considered pharaohs too, but I personally don't consider them pharaohs because they weren't originally. But in history, sometimes they would say, call them pharaohs. Okay, so you got to be careful of that. Just because a historian says pharaoh, that doesn't mean that that stock or that group of people was originally from that land. Okay. The next definition is Serket, and Serket is a goddess. She goes back to the pre-dynastic period of Egypt, known as the healer of poisonous stings, known as the protector of the canopic jars. We discussed that. She was a goddess, and this goddess history goes back to about 4,000 to 3,000 BC. And BC stands for before Christ or before Common Era, okay? And basically, it lets you know that the Africans honored gods and goddesses. Some religious people make it seem as though that the title that they give God is the original title, and that's not necessarily the case. Okay, we didn't have a god without a goddess in our original thinking of who a higher power was, which is God. We had always had a god, we had a goddess, we had a family. Our triad or trinity consisted of a man, a woman, and a child. And you know, originally with Africans, it wasn't, you know, only male figures or only male characters. Okay? Because when you think of an angel now, you think of a male. You know, you don't think of a female angel. You know what I'm saying? If you used to go to church, they mention angels like Michael and, you know, Lucifer. You know, these are male characteristics. Well, they didn't have just male characteristics of higher powers back then. They also had female characteristics, and G'O.A.T was one of them. And the reason why she's important, because on an artifact that we talked about, it was a piece of pottery. The pre-dynastic king, his name was King Selk. He honored the goddess G'O.A.T. Okay? He honored her, letting you know that they honored gods and goddesses back then. She was also a protector of the canopic jars. When Egyptians passed away, they would leave some of their body parts in what was called canopic jars. All right? Because they believed in the afterlife. All right? And it was a representation of what they needed in the next life to come. So G'O.A.T was also known as a goddess who protected these canopic jars. Okay? So she had a few roles, you know, in her divinity. King Narmer, known as the Horus King, dated around 4000 to 3000 BC, the first king of the dynastic period. He was different from King Selk, even though some people say it was the same thing, the same person. I don't believe that. I believe that, you know, King Narmer was the successor of King Selk, who ruled Upper Egypt. And then when King Narmer came along, he ruled Upper and Lower Egypt. And on the palette that we're going to be talking about today, it shows you that he conquered Upper and Lower Egypt. And that's what made him the first king of the first dynasty of Egypt. Because he conquered Upper and Lower Egypt. He combined them. And, you know, he started that whole pattern of the dynasties. First dynasty, the second dynasty. Another definition that we need to know is archaeology. I've defined this before, but I just want to reiterate since we are dealing with archaeological artifacts. All right? Archaeology is the scientific study of human remains and artifacts. Artifacts themselves is the actual physical, tangible evidence, what we're about to look at today. Usually, after research, this evidence is the closest thing that we can get to the factual information behind what went on during that time that we're talking about. If you notice, there are two words, this is what I like to do, in the word artifact. You got art and you got facts. Now we've defined what a fact is. If you don't know the definition of a fact, you should go look it up. And we all know what art is. And usually when they find a remain of humans in ancient times, it's artistic. That's what I noticed. It's artistic. So that's how I believe this word came about. Before we go off into the next section of this lecture, I want to discuss the importance of understanding a timeline. All right? This is how a timeline works when you're dealing with history. All right? When you see something that says 5000 BC, when you're dealing with the BC usually declines. All right? So you go from 5000 BC to explain. Later on, it'll be 4000 BC. All right? Later on, it'll be 3000 BC. All the way until it go up to 0 AD. 0 AD is supposedly when Jesus Christ was born. So in order for people to understand this timeline, what they did was they adjusted this timeline, and the abbreviation that they like to use is BC or before Christ. Another abbreviation they like to use is BCE, which means before Common Era. That's the one that I like to use because I don't understand how somebody can use a timeline of a man who has no archaeological evidence to back up that he existed. So I try to use BCE. But for other people to understand, sometimes I have to use BC. All right? Once it gets to AD, which stands for, in Latin, Anno Domini, which means the year of our Lord, still referring to Jesus Christ, it goes up. All right? It increases. It goes from 0 AD to 1000 AD, as you can see on the board. 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, all the way till we get to the year 2012 AD, and that's where we are today.